Hey guys, my name is Thomas Davis. I'm the current author of Backbone Tutorials, which I started in 2011. Today we're just going to be going over a very beginner overview of Backbone.js and its components, and how a RESTful server could tie into the index page. All the code samples and demos are on GitHub in the Backbone's repo, and a lot of the links are included in the README. So there are many different approaches to using Backbone.js, and today we're just going to use a very ambiguous one that I'm not enforcing any best practices or any style of coding. I'm really just going over the components and how they all tie together. The author intended, Jeremy Ashkenas intended, that Backbone.js has a very robust philosophy to keep it very simple as to not dictate anything as compared to a few of the other client MVCs at the moment. I would attribute most of its success to this philosophy because anyone can pick up Backbone.js and use it in any environment that they have. You can find more information about me on my website. If you want to get in contact, just with my Twitter and my GitHub page. And today we're going to also be using CDN.js for loading the libraries. CDN.js is just a community curated repository of popular client-side frameworks for the internet. We're going to load off Twitter Bootstrap, underscore, and Backbone, and jQuery, sorry. Also, you can see that I'm working on a plugin called SEO Server, which simply creates a server which redirects your Googlebot to the correct content when trying to index a single page application. For anyone that knows, single page applications have a difficult time being indexed on Google because of their only JavaScript, which Google has issues trying to render. So today we're actually going to be building a user manager app. So we simply want to be able to list out a bunch of users, add new users, edit new users, and delete users. So and we also want to do this all on our server. So this all has to be brought in and updated on our remote server. So if you look at our network tab, we're going to be firing off AJAX requests as we browse this demo. And we can see what's happening behind the scenes. So when we go to edit record, we can see that it sends off a network request to get the details of that one record. And if we update it, we can see that it fires off another network request, a put request to the server, which translates to update this record with this ID on the server. After we put, it redirects back to the index page, and we can see that it did a get to the users resource, and here the server returns an array of user objects with their corresponding IDs. So today we're going to be covering routes, which you can see in the top of the window. Routes are used for remembering the page state and preserving the history of the page, so we can use the back and forward buttons. Also, if we refresh the page, we can see that the correct page loads. So let's go back. So we're going to have an index page for this app, which loads a list, a new page, and an edit page. We're not implementing any validation today, just simple input and output. And the server for this example is already built and it's linked in the README. I've deployed it onto Heroku, as you can see down here in the network request. This server is CORS enabled, so anyone can actually run up this demo and just use this implemented server for them. Or you can run it up yourself. So our example server uses a RESTful API, and the poorly written documentation can be found in the README. We have 5 calls that we're using today. The first one is get users, which returns a list of user objects. We have get user ID, which returns a singular object based off the ID. And we have post to users, which creates a new user based off the payload and returns a new user object with a new ID given by the server. We then have put user ID and delete user ID, which updates and deletes this given user from the server. So I'm just using a Chrome extension here called Postman to show you the calls. This is our Heroku app at the top. You can simply do a GET request to our users call, and we can see that it returns a list of user objects. I can then pass an ID into the call, and we should get back a single user object. Not found, it was a typo. And we can see it returns 1. So these calls become very important when populating our backbone.js client. So earlier I've created a diagram to show what we're going to do today. On the left we can see our index page, our single page application, and on our right you can see the RESTful server that I just showed you the documentation for. So what we want to do is get the RESTful server talking to the index page, and everything in between has to be in a nice modularized way so you can reuse and test components easily. So backbone.js takes care of a lot of this hassle. So we can see that our index page calls a backbone router, which controls the page navigation. And we can see that we have the index route, the edit route, and the new route. We'll start with the index route. The index route is going to load a view called list users, and it's going to rely on the backbone.js user collection, which relies on a GET request to the user's resource on the RESTful server. We can see that our edit route and new route on our backbone app is going to reuse an edit user view. Because they have the same data, we can use the same form to use it for updating and creating new users. And we're going to use a backbone.js user model. And we're going to talk to the resource endpoint user's ID, which we have support for get, post, put, and delete. So hopefully this diagram makes things more clear, and we'll jump straight into creating our first backbone route to list out the current users on the server. So today we're actually going to implement all of this in line on the index.html, and we're not going to put our scripts into separate files. I highly recommend using AMD, which is a module format created by James Burke, and he has a client library called require.js, which allows you to throw each of these views and collections and routes into separate files, so your system becomes more modular. Of course, our views are in charge of rendering our templates and attaching events, so we can listen for button clicks and form submissions to do the correct action. We'll see that through our REST API, our user collections, our backbone collections, will generally be populated by an array, and our model will always be populated by an object. That's the difference between a model and a collection. And of course, models exist inside of a collection, so we'll go more into that soon. So we're going to start by setting up our index.html file for today's example. This folder exists inside the Backbone tutorials repository on GitHub. We have a README with instructions and the REST documentation. We have a completed example and the barebone index file, which we're going to begin with today. So you can see that I've already loaded in Twitter Bootstrap the theme. That's just so it looks pretty while we're working with it. We're using the CDN.js repository, which is hosted on Cloudflare, and it has, I think, over 20 edge locations, so you can load files quite quickly. But what we're going to do first is bring in backbone.js. So our first dependency for backbone.js is jQuery. So if we just jump to our browser, we can go to CDN.js, and we're going to load in jQuery. The next library we have to load in, which is _JS. It's another dependency for backbone.js. So I'll just grab the underscore from CDN.js. Throw that in there. And the last library, of course, is backbone.js itself. And we can see on CDN.js we have a few other backbone.js plugins hosted. you'll eventually dive into these depending on what you want to do with your application. But today we're just going to load in backbone.js. You can see at the beginning of our source we have left off the protocol, so we haven't specified HTTP or HTTPS. CDN.js supports both. Why we leave it off is because browsers actually pick up which version you want to, which protocol you want to use. If you specify HTTP and it's on a HTTPS domain, then it'll pop up a annoying little alert telling your user that it's not secure, etc., etc. So it's actually easier just to leave off the protocol and let the browser do the hard work. So I've got this is the index file currently on the local host, and we can see that we're just bringing in those libraries, and currently can't see anything because we haven't created any HTML. So we're just going to add in some elements so we know what we're doing. So we're going to call this the user manager. Twitter Bootstrap actually gives us a class called container, which simply creates a 960 pixel div that's centered automatically, and we can put our page inside of it. We're just going to put a HR for aesthetics, and we're going to create a div with a class called page, which is going to be the container for our user list and our user forms. So if we just close that off and check that out in the browser, we can see that we have a heading and nothing else showing right now. We're going to put our scripts at the bottom, so we load our scripts after HTML, which means that we don't stop page rendering, and we'll start writing our backbone.js app down below. Again, we're going to be doing everything inline today, but I highly recommend using a module system such as AMD to take care of your dependencies. So the first thing we're going to do is create a backbone router which loads the index route, which is just a route with no parameters, and we're going to call it our homepage. And our homepage is going to load the list users view. We're not going to hook it up to the server right now. We're just going to create a view which activates when a certain route is triggered, and we're going to render some content to the page to see if it's all working. So if we jump back to our code, we can create a new backbone router by using backbone syntax. Hopefully I won't make any typos. So the backbone router takes an object called routes and allows us to specify different actions to do depending on what route is in the browser navigation. So we can actually throw in many different things here. So if we said when it's hit the pricing URL, load up a pricing template, or simply leave it blank for the home page. We can also pass in parameters, so ID will match anything in one URL, or we can pass in a glob which will match everything, and we can pass these parameters into our callbacks later. I'll show you how, but for now we're just going to load the home route by specifying nothing, and we want to trigger a route called home. So we can actually create a new instance of this router by using the new keyword, and now we want to listen for routes. So the router class actually emits an event called route in the namespace. So jQuery lets us hook into this event namespace, and we can listen for route called home. And our second parameter is the callback, what we want to happen once we receive this route, and we can simply just console log we have loaded the home page. Before any of Backbone's page navigation and router works, we actually have to start the history. So this will tell Backbone to start listening to the URL and nothing will happen until we start this line. So now if we jump back to our page, we can refresh, and we should see a console log. So we have loaded the home page. If I pass in a route that isn't the home page and refresh it, we shouldn't see anything appear in the console, which we don't. So we can jump back to the home page, and again it triggers that route. So next up, we want to create a backbone view which renders some content to the page. So we're just going to start by creating a backbone view. We're going to use this for displaying the user list, so we call it the user list, and we use the backbone view syntax to create one. Now each backbone view is assigned an element. The element is the container for the view, so anything that happens inside the view, actions and rendering, should all happen inside the children of the element, and the view should never outreach its own element. You can work on as many children as you like inside the view, but sometimes you might want to even split up the children into their own views, let them have their own views to handle them. But today we're just going to use the page element that we have already to render our user list. So each view has a render function, and the render function is in charge of just rendering the view to the page, so loading in a template and the data and compiling a template to put into the DOM. So for now we're actually just going to try put some dummy data in. We're going to use this $L, which is a backbone.js cheat to quickly reference the cached element. And we're going to set its element to content should show here. So what we have to do now is create a new instance of this view, and then render that instance when our router finds the home route. So we're just going to create a user list instance, and down where we were doing console log, instead we're going to delete that line, and we're going to render our user list instead. So now if we refresh our page, our home route should trigger. It should detect the event and then render our new view into the page element. And let's just try that out. And as we can see, content should show here has popped up. That's great. So now we can hook up our collection to load in the user list. So now we're actually going to bring down the users array so we can actually have some data to play with. But once we have the array of data, we're going to render a table which shows each array element, which is the user objects. So what we need to do is create a new collection for our users. So using the backbone syntax, we can say var users equals backbone collection.extend, and we want to specify a URL endpoint for this collection. So we know that from our RESTful documentation, /users returns a list of users, and that should be sufficient. One quick thing is that because we're using a remote server, our AJAX calls have to be fired to that remote server. If we don't change anything, they'll try to be fired to localhost. So we're going to actually have to use an AJAX pre-filter, which I've included in the README. So an AJAX pre-filter hooks into all AJAX requests and allows us to modify the base URL of all our AJAX requests. So you can see here that we're simply, before one is fired, we're grabbing the URL and prepending our Heroku server with our RESTful API. You might not need to do this in your application. I always generally do, as I host my service externally to my client. But now when we fire off an AJAX call, it'll be the space URL plus the resource URL. So we can actually bring down some user data now. So in our render function, we're going to instantiate a new user collection, users, sorry. And now we can use Backbone to fetch down the data from that resource. So fetch takes an object which lets us specify a callback for the success. So on success, we simply want to let's just render our template when it's successful, and we can check out a network tab to see if that data actually came down. So if we refresh the page and jump to our network tab, we can see it sent off a GET request, and it did return the data, but it didn't render the template because of an error. Now the error is because this callback function is anonymous. This doesn't actually have any scope. So a quick hack to fix that is we can assign the scope to another variable and then pass it down. So that equals this, and I think Douglas Crockford recommends this for passing around scope. So now we can say, so that.l, which is that being this backbone view, let's set its element HTML to content should show here when the fetch is finished. So we can see that the fetch was successful and rendered the template. But now we actually want to show the content. So we're going to use underscores templating function, and we're going to say create a variable called template, which will hold our compiled template. And using underscores templating function, it takes two parameters. The first one is a string, or a string of content, and the second one is some data to pass into that string of content. And then we kind of have access to a PHP-like syntax where we can modify variables inside of the string template. So we're going to actually, and on success, the user's collection is actually passed down into the function. So what we're going to do is first create a template for this view. So I generally load my templates in using a loading system, and that way they can be compiled into the JavaScript file relatively easy. And so when I compile, I usually compile, I have only 3 files, one JavaScript file which contains my JavaScript and my templates, one CSS file, and then one image sprite. So it's pretty fast to load assets. So we're going to create a script tag to store our template, and we're going to give it a type of text template. This stops the browser from rendering it, and we're going to give it an ID of user list template, so we can get the contents of this template for using in our rendering function. So we have the user list template ID here. We can grab its contents to be used in the underscore templating function by using jQuery. So we're going to select the user list template.html, and we're going to pass in the users collection. Now the users collection has a bunch of methods on it, and the actual array of models is stored in users.models. Because we don't need the other functions, we're just going to pass down the models to our template. Once this template's loaded, we can render it to our HTML. And let's just throw something in here to test before we get further in. So what should happen is our user collection should fire, come back successful, underscore will compile a template using our inline script template, and we're going to pass in these variables, but we're not actually using them anywhere inside our template just yet. So all we should see is testing template. And we have another JavaScript error, invalid bracket. Sorry, I put too many brackets, parentheses there. So we can see that our template's loaded in. So now, in our template up here, we can actually start creating a table. So using Twitter styling. I'm just going to make it pretty using the table and stripes class. We're going to create a heading. So the first row is going to be the user's first name, column, sorry. The second column is going to be the last name. The third column is going to be the age. And we're just going to create an empty column at the end for storing buttons. Now we can create the actual rows of the body by using tbody. Great, so for anyone who's used server-rendered dynamic server pages, we can actually put our logic inside the template using underscores syntax. You can actually, there's a lot of different templating libraries such as Mastache and Handlebars, but today I'm just going to use underscore. So for each user we actually want to create a row. So using underscore, we this caret and percentage shows that we want to start a templating function. So we want to loop through the users. So whatever's passed in our templating function is available in our template as a first level variable. So for each users, let's loop through them and run a function over them. This actually exposes the user variable for us to use programmatically, anything inside. And that's just that's how you loop over a collection in underscore. So we're going to create a tr element, a td element. We're going to have 4 of those, and tr element. Cool. Now, so to print out variables in underscore templating, we actually use this syntax. And instead of just executing a block, this actually echoes out a block. So we can echo out user dot get first name. So user is a model inside the collection, and get is backbone.js' way of getting and setting attributes. So we're going to use get to get the first name attribute and print it out into the table. And then we're just going to do that for the last name and the age. Fingers crossed that should render out a table. Beautiful. So you can now see that we've rendered the table, and we can move on to the next step of updating records, deleting records, and creating new records. But that's the simplest way to load in a collection. And as we can see, that is simply a representation of the HTTP call that got sent off. That concludes building this top line. So we created a route for their home, created a list users view which fetched from the user collection, which brought down data from the server and rendered to the page. As you can see, HTML is actually not being escaped at the moment, so we're vulnerable to cross-site scripting hacks. I left a snippet of code in the README which allows you to escape any input and output, so you won't be vulnerable, and the official one on Backbone tutorials will be escaped, but I'm not gonna implement it in this tutorial. So the next thing we want to do is allow for a new user to be added. So in our list template, we're just going to throw a button at the top that allows us to go to the new user page. So we can create a link. We use hashtags to create Backbone links because it's all single page application. We can't use regular links unless you're using push state, but push state's only IE8 plus compatible. Sorry, IE9 plus. So for today we're just going to use hashtags. But Backbone.js actually gracefully degrades, so you can put hashtags in your code, but if the browser supports push state, it'll actually remove the hashes from the URL. And you just do things as you normally do. So according to our diagram, we want to create a new route called /new, which will show the edit user view. We're going to render a form for creating a new user and just attach an event to listen for submission of this form. Once it's submitted, we're going to create a new user model and save it to the server. And then we're just simply going to redirect back to the index page. So we start by creating the new route, and we're just going to use Twitter Bootstrap's classes to make it pretty, and we're going to call it new user, and we'll just put in a HR divider to make it prettier. And if we just refresh the page, we can see that we now have a new route exposed. So if we click on it, we can see that the browser navigation didn't refresh, it simply just appended to the URL /new. So now we can create a new route to listen for when the URL changes. So we jump down here and we say if the route is new, we want to throw an edit user route. And down here we can listen for the edit user route again, much like we did for the home route. So on route of edit user, we will just want to console log show user form. So if I refresh the page, we're currently on the new route, we should see a console log saying show user form. So now we can create a view which will render out a form. So as we did up here, we're going to create a new one called edit user, which is a backbone view, and we're going to set its element to page also. So we want to just load it over where the list was, for example. So they reuse the same container element. And on render, we will want to throw in to the elements HTML, show the form here. Now down here we're going to render a new instance that we can use to render. So we called it edit user view, and we want to create a new instance of it. And like we did above, we can say edit user.render. And if we refresh the page, we should see content loaded in. And if we click back, we can see that the list view renders. If we click forward, we can see that the edit user view renders. So we're actually going to create a text template like we did for the list, and instead we're going to throw a form in this time. So I'm just going to copy and paste this rendering function. And we have scope for this, and instead of using the user list template, we're going to use the edit user template. We don't have any variables to pass in, so we're just going to pass a blank object in, and then we're going to create the template inline up above, much like we did for the user list template. So we can say script type equals text template, and the ID equals the edit user template. And again, we just matched it up to here, edit user template, and we're just getting the HTML from this element. So using our compiled template. So we can start by writing the form. I might get the syntax wrong, but let's just try it out. I'm just going to give this form a class called edit user form. We're going to give it a legend. I'm going to say create user. We're going to give it an input, type equals text, with a name equals first name, and I'll just see what order I put it in the example. So we're going to put a label above the inputs, first name, and we're just going to do that for the last name and the age. for now we're just gonna might throw in a divider and throw in a button that submits the form. So we'll make it button type equals submit, class equals button, so Twitter styling, and that should be all we need, and we'll just call it create user. I'll just call it create. Now if we refresh our page, this template should be loaded in with the form intact. Awesome, so now we have a form that we can use for submitting data to the server. So now we actually want to create a user model, a backbone.js model, which is populated by the contents of this form. When we submit, this backbone.js model will have the first name, last name, and age attribute. And if we call save on the model, because it doesn't have an ID, backbone.js knows to post it to the server instead of put. If we had an ID in this form, then backbone.js would send a put request, which updates the record. But for today, we're just going to post a record. So we're going to jump down into our view, and we're going to listen for form submission. So backbone.js lets us have an events hash, and we're going to listen for the first. So we're going to listen for submit of the edit user form, and once it's submitted, we want to save the user. So the backbone.js event hash actually lets us attach different events. So if we want to click or button do action, so the first word is the event, and the second, separated by a space, is the elements that you want to attach the event to. But for now, we're just going to use a submit event, and we're going to create a function that backbone.js knows to call. So whatever you enclose in strings here, in quotes, will be called. So we're going to call the save user method of this view, and it actually passes in an event object, which is a native JavaScript object that gives us access to the event that happened. And we can actually access the form that was submitted by using jQuery and accessing the current target of the event, which is the form itself. And we actually want to convert this form data into an object that can be populated into our model. So jQuery doesn't actually support converting form inputs into JSON natively. So someone actually wrote a script that serializes a form into an object, and that was on Stack Overflow. I've been using this script for a long time, and you'll find yourself having to use this for forms quite a lot. So if we just copy that into our, at the top here where our little snippets are, so we can see that if we take a jQuery object and call a serialized object, it will turn the name properties of the form into an object. So if we jump down to our event, save user, we can say user details is equal to the current target, which is the form, and convert its fields into an object. And we'll just console log that for now, just to make sure that we're getting the correct details. By default, form submission will refresh the page, so we want to cancel the default behavior of the browser. For anyone who's cancelled events before, you can actually return false, which will tell the browser to stop executing the native behavior, and the form should just submit and then not do anything else, and we should see our user details. So if we refresh the page, Thomas Davis 12, we can see that the form didn't submit, and we console logged the user details, which should be an object of the form details. So that's great. So now we can throw that straight into a backbone.js model. So first of all, we have to create the backbone.js model. We're just going to create it like we did our collection, but instead we're going to create a model, and we're going to call it the user. So it's simply just for single entities, whereas a collection is used for an array of entities. We actually have a different syntax for the URL. It's called the URL root, and backbone.js knows how to append IDs to this URL root when doing different requests. So if we did a put request, it'll append an ID onto the end. If we did a delete request, it'll append an ID. If we did a post request, though, because there is no ID, we'll just post it straight to the URL root. So it's quite intelligent. So when we submit the form, we're going to create a new user model. So equals new user, and we're going to call save, which will save it to the server. The first parameter is the values we want to save to the server. So user details is the values we want to send to the server, and the second parameter is what we want to do is an options hash. In the options hash, we can specify what we want to do on success. So on success, we want to just alert the user that was saved, and we can simply say user.toJSON, and we'll alert that out when it's saved. So if we just refresh the page, we should now get an alert as an object. So toJSON didn't exactly work. I'll just quickly change that to a console.log. Refresh the page, and we can see that it console logged the model once we saved it. So if we look at the network request that got sent off, we can see that backbone.js sent a post request, and it sent in the payload the values that we specified in the object in the form, and we can see that it returned the same values, but now we also have an ID because the server saved the value. When an ID is returned from the server, backbone.js automatically adds it to the model on the client. So you can see now that we have access to the model with the ID and its attributes. So now that we have a successful form submission, let's just simply redirect the router. Let's navigate it back to the home page. So we can navigate it straight back to the home route, and router.navigate is used for saving state of your page. So if you want the back and forward browser buttons to work, you generally want to update your URLs as you go. This is actually silent by default, so if we navigate, it won't trigger any of the routes, so it'll only update the URL. To trigger the routes, we actually have to tell it explicitly to trigger. So once saved our user, on success, we're going to just navigate back to our list, and our user that we created should be visible in the list. So if we just jump back and refresh, let's try create 2pack Shakur, age 45, create. On success, it took us back to the list, and we can see there's 2pack Shakur, age 45. And we can just do that again. Vanessa, someone, age 70, create. And we can see that our list is updated again. So that's essentially how we can submit a form and create a new user on the database. So what we've done here is we've implemented a route called new on the client. When the route is triggered, we created an edit user view which loads a user model and sends off a post request to the users /ID to /users. That should actually probably be pointing to users. So the next thing we're going to do is now update our user. So the last thing we want to do today is edit and delete our model, our users. So if we look at our UI, we want to be able to delete rows from here and update them also. So looking at our diagram, we can see that we're just going to reuse the edit user view. Because it's the same form for updating a user, we're going to use the view and the same template, but we're going to put some conditionals in. If there is an ID present, it means we're actually editing a user. If there isn't an ID present, then we're obviously creating a user. So we can put some if statements in our template to include the ID attribute in our form. That way when we save it to Backbone, we know Backbone will know to do a put request instead of a post. So we're going to create a route that allows us to pass in an ID. When our route triggers, that ID from the URL will be passed into the view. We're going to load the same template, throw the conditionals in, so the form contains the ID. On submit, it'll do a put request to users/ID because there was an ID present. So we can jump back to our code. First thing we have to do is throw in a link to the edit page. So we're just going to throw that in the last column that we left spare in our table. So we jump to our table code. We're going to create a link to the edit page, and we're going to make the link contain the ID of the current user. So in this row, what is the user's ID? User.id. And we'll just give that a class for styling, which is Twitter Bootstrap. I'm going to call that the edit link. So if we refresh our page, we should see that we now have an edit button. And if we click the edit button, you can see that it triggers a route which contains the ID to the resource. Just click this over here. Now we have to create a background route to handle that. So we jump down to our code. We're going to simply create a new route in our routes object. So on edit, and if there is an ID parameter in the URL, we're going to call the same function, but this time we know that we have an ID, so this function that listens for this route actually gets passed the splat, it's called, the ID from the route into the function. When this calls a function, ID will be sent into the listener, but ID will be undefined. That's okay, we can just put in some conditional to detect if it's undefined. But now we're going to pass this ID into our render function for our edit user view. So now we can go up to where our render function was for edit user. And the render function gets passed an options object, which will contain the ID which is passed in. So we're going to do two things. If the ID is present, then we're going to bring down the details and populate the form. If it's not, we're just going to render a blank form. So we can say if options.id is present, then we'll do a get request to get the details. Otherwise, we're just going to render the normal template and leave it blank. So to get that ID, we're gonna just create, because we want to fetch details fresh all the time in case someone will refresh the page on the form. We always want to bring down the details. So we can create a new user model here, and we can give it an ID because we know what ID it is from the URL. So I can now perform a user.fetch, which will trigger on the server. It'll trigger get users and the ID of the user. And we can pass the fetch function an object, which will contain our success callback, which will return the user. So if successful, we want to render the same template but pass in the new user, the user model that got returned. Because we're in a callback here, I'm going to have to set var that equals this again. So we can keep the scope of the view. And we're just going to copy the same render function here. But this time we're going to pass in the user object as a variable. And of course we have to change this to that so that it knows to use the scope of the view. And on success, compile the template with the user details inserted, and then render it to the page. If no ID is present, just operate as usual and don't pass in any user object. But to make things easier, we're just going to pass in user equals null, so we can do if statements in our template easier. So user equals null. So now we can jump up to our template. First thing we can do is just to see if the edit page loads. So obviously we were on the edit URL just then, it did load, but we'll just jump back again and we'll go to the edit page. Obviously we haven't inserted the data yet, but if we check out the network request, we can see that when we went to this form, it did a GET request to users/ID. So that's, since we set the ID on the model, it knows to send off a GET request to this URL. What we want to do next is insert the values of that GET request so you can do an update correctly. Plus we're going to change some of these labels to appropriately say what they are doing if we're updating. So we can use single line if statements in JavaScript, and we're going to print out a label. But if the user object is not null, then this is what we do: update, else print out create. So that's actually a single line if statement. This is the operator, so if true or false. If true, we do what's after the question mark, so we're printing out update. If false, we're printing out create. So we can see that ID is present, ID is being sent in, so we are fetching this user object and it is available. So this should say update user, as it does. But if we jump back to our new form, we can see that it says create user because no user object was passed in. So we're going to reuse this conditional if statement to add some pre-populated values to our form. So if an ID is present, if we did pull down the user details, then we should be able to print them out. Otherwise, we just leave the value blank. So we can say, if the user is present, then user.get the first name, else print an empty string into the value. And we're just going to copy that print statement down into the value for the last name. And we're just going to copy it down into the value for the age. And just make sure we update those getters for the attributes. So user.get last name and user.get age. Now, because we're updating, this form would also have to contain the ID. Otherwise, Backbone will try to create a new record, whereas we want to update one. So if we are updating a user, because if the user object present, we're simply going to add a hidden element, input type hidden, and give it a value of our user.id. We could most likely get this ID programmatically in our view, but we're just going to throw it here also, just to make things more clear. And instead of saying create, we also want to we'll just copy our conditional from up here for our button. If the user is available, let's do an update. If it's not, let's do a create. And that should give us an ID. So if we jump back to our page, refresh it, go to edit, we can just analyze we can see that the values have now been populated, and if we went to a new user, they're obviously not populated. And we'll just check that our hidden ID attribute is loaded in the DOM also. So we can see down here the ID is present. We just got to name that hidden input ID. So when we serialize this form, we'll get an object containing first name, last name, age, and ID. So Backbone will know to do a put request instead of a post. So we jump back to our code. We can see on submit of edit user form, we save the user. We don't have to change anything here because our ID is present. It'll contain the ID and the attributes here. So when we do a save, it'll do a put request instead. And we can just check that out right now by opening our network tab and changing the age to 1000. And it did a post request, which is wrong. So let's just figure out why it did that. Give me one moment. So we can see in the payload the ID was obviously not added to the object. So our serialized object is not working, so we'll just check out our form again. Input type, name equals hidden. If user, let's put a semicolon there. Might just try run that again. So you have to be careful to include semicolons when using the templating library. It obviously didn't execute that block correctly, but now we have put to the server working. So we're putting the ID, the age, the last name and the first name, and we're just getting back the same data. And just to show you in the UI that it's actually updating, we'll change Thomas Davis to be 23 years old. And we can see Thomas Davis is updated now to be 23 years old. So that's simply put working, updating a user. The last thing we want to do is just add a delete button. So we'll add one here, and it'll just trigger delete and redirect back to the list. So we go to our edit user form, which is down here. Now I might just put this below so we can do it all in one if statement. But if we are editing a user, we're going to throw in a button. Class equals, this is just for Twitter theming. We're going to call it the danger button, so it's red. And we're going to call it delete. Give it a class of delete. So now, if we refresh the page, we should see a big delete button. Beautiful. And currently it doesn't do anything. Well, it's trying to submit the form, but we'll put an event handler on that to send off or destroy to the server. So we can jump back down to our edit user view, and in our events we're going to throw on click of the delete button, so we're referencing it by its class name, .delete. We're going to delete the user, and we'll just throw a function down here called delete user. And we're going to return false to cancel any normal event delegation from activating. So at the moment we haven't actually attached this model to this view. Our model's up instantiated up here in the scope of this function, so we don't have access to it. But we can simply just attach it to our view by using the scope of this. So it's going to use the that variable. and we're going to say if there is an ID present, attach the user to this view so I can access it down here, and we can do things the same. So that.user fetch. So when I go to delete, I actually have a copy of that.user here, and I can simply just call destroy on it. And on destroy, we get an object of options, and we're just going to pass it a success callback. And what we're going to do is just simply redirect back to the home page again. So now we can just copy router.navigate in here. So on delete, we should be able to navigate back to the home page. So I'll just save that and refresh the page. Now we'll just watch the network tab closely, so we can see that we did a GET request to bring down the details. On click of delete, sent off put request. So it's obviously still trying to submit the form. Just going to jump back up here. I'm just going to type equals button so it stops submitting the form, and let's just refresh that again and try execute a delete. Now the event's not working, so we just double check. Class equals delete. On click of delete, run delete user. That is not defined, so we're getting an error. It's because I copied and pasted, which I shouldn't have done. I'm just going to change that to this. So this views.user, which we attached up here, we're just going to destroy it, which sends off a delete operation. So it will send off a delete operation to users /ID. And then watch that in action. So you see that it sent off a delete request and came back successful. And of course the record's missing, so let's delete 2 back just to verify, and delete, and we have no 2 back. So that's about all we're going to go through for today. We covered how to set up routes, and how to activate views, and how to bring data down using collections and models, and using get, post, put, and delete. So how can you? That's all the operations you can use on a model. So we've now implemented this whole diagram. We've covered collections, models, routers, views, and how it all ties into the server. Just to go through the UI one more time, we can see that our collection fetch has populated our list view, which uses a template. Our new user form and our edit form use the same view and the same template using some conditionals. And we of course have put request through updating, delete request through destroying the model, and post request through creating a model. We have all our routes working. So at the top here, if we refresh the page, it loads the same route, and if we push back, all our navigation works. And that's all through Backbone's magic. Backbone actually offers a lot more than what I've shown you, such as binding events to models and how the attributes change, how collections change. There's a lot of power, and the best thing about Backbone is that you should be able to use it in any environment that you wish. I've shown you some code here. This is not exactly what I do when I'm in production. I always use AMD, and many people use things like CoffeeScript to create their Backbone clients. I prefer to stick to raw JavaScript. Again, compilation, you can always compile all your Backbone into one JavaScript file and still operate in the same way, and it's great to put all your templates in the same compilation and serve it off a CDN like we have here. So your assets can be served in under 50 milliseconds if just your entire app if you want. Remember that the README for this tutorial is in the same folder, and it goes over the snippets of code, the RESTful documentation, and some other little nuggets. Again, I'll just show you the way of preventing cross-site scripting is to use a function down here. We simply create a div with JavaScript and make the text value and grab the HTML, which sanitizes it so you won't be so vulnerable to cross-site scripting. The jQuery serialized object turns a form into an object, and the pre-filter lets us put our server address in. But I highly recommend checking out the tutorial on the site called Organizing Your Backbone.js with AMD. It's quite a big pattern, and it's used in a lot of the current frameworks. I encourage you to leave feedback and questions, and just leave them on Backbone Tutorials or get in contact on Twitter. And you should be able to check out the demo live on Backbone Tutorials. But if you have any problems again, just send me a message. Thanks for listening.